This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben. We've got a few updates on the gubernatorial election front this week, new campaign finance reports, and a debate among the Republican candidates. Well, most of the Republican candidates, I should say.
Most of them. Emphasis on the most. That's right. And let's start with the debate that happened Wednesday night, since it's the first one of the election. Air horns here. The expected candidates were there: Mike Cox, Eric Nesbitt, Anthony Hudson, Tom Leonard, Ralph Rebant, and Carla Wagner. And we'll get into them in a minute, but let's start with a very notable exception. There was no John James. Alethia, where was he?
Yeah, so John James said shortly before the debate that he would not participate in this one that was this week and two others that are being organized by the Michigan Republican Party, but he would consider a primary debate once the field is more settled. James, is the perceived front runner, and he seems to be saying it is very early for this. And, it is worth noting that some of these candidates that are on these debate stages may not make it to the ballot. And, I also think that calling these events, which again are organized by the Michigan Republican Party, a debate is sort of generous. At the event this week, the candidates seemed to agree on most issues. They were friendly with each other, though notably they were not friendly toward James, who was not there.
Well,
and
it's easy to kick somebody when they're not there.
It's easy. It's too easy. And James, right now he has all of the name ID and he is pulling ahead. I do think there's maybe some risk. He has already made some GOP delegates mad by skipping a different event organized by the state party. So, let's just say he does win the primary. You want these diehard Republican voters to be excited about your candidacy heading into the general, and he might have to smooth some things over there.
Yeah, and there were, 150 people that came to this event. So, this is something that is interesting to people within the party base. So, no John James, but we had 6 candidates there in Sparta, all of them trying to make a good pitch for why they should be their party's nominee. And they seem to have a few, maybe different points or themes that they really wanted to focus on. For example, a candidate we haven't really spoken a lot about on the show, conservative activist Carla Wagner, she was really focused on getting rid of property taxes, as she's the leader of a ballot proposal hoping to get rid of property taxes.
Yeah, I think this event is helping candidates like Wagner, like Hudson and Rebant, who, they really want to get their names out there somewhat. This wasn't televised, but it was covered by news organizations. So I think, it is showing people, we are here. But, we also, like I said, saw a lot of agreement from candidates in their positions on labor, tax cuts, and economic development. And there are 2 more of these in the next month. So we'll see if we learn anything different in the weeks ahead, if we start to see other candidates starting to butt heads other than, the candidates who show up just trying to take on John James.
Also in the gubernatorial race, campaign finance reports were due this week from all parties. John James, Democrat Jocelyn Benson, and Independent Mike Duggan raised the most from donors in the race. But Mike Cox actually has the most cash on hand, in part because he loaned his campaign $2 million of his own dollars. Alethia, we talk a lot about how much money candidates raise, how they spend it, etc. But what I want to talk about this week is where the money is coming from. It feels like if you're a candidate getting a lot of money from donors, the people actually voting, that's a good sign for your campaign, no?
Yeah, I think if someone is donating to your campaign, that signals interest, right? But I also think money spends the same regardless of where it came from, right? Yeah. So you can also break it down even more and say, well, this candidate had more low dollar donations, another candidate received more large donations from wealthier individuals. Which one is better? And even then you can go even further and say, well, this was in state, this was out of state. There are a lot of ways you can try to rank contributions, but for a candidate to be successful, they have to spend their money well and they have to do the work. It's not always all about money, although money is a large factor that we will talk about more. Like you noted, Mike Cox did end up putting $2 million more in his campaign after launching with $1 million of his own dollars as well. He told us on MichMash earlier this year that he wanted to raise money when we asked him if he was going to put more of his own wealth behind his campaign, but instead he seems to be mostly self-funding to this point.
And to your point about money spending the same, John James is sitting with 2.3 million on hand, but is also quick to note a super PAC that is supporting him is sitting on 5 million as well. Among the other higher tier Republicans, Eric Nesbitt is sitting with 2 million on hand and Tom Leonard with about $700,000.
And then we have the Democrats. Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson continues to dominate in the Democratic primary, which at this point is just hers to lose. Benson has $3 million on hand right now, which is significantly ahead of Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson and Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist, who both have about $380,000 sitting in the bank.
Boy, if you are Swanson or Gilchrist, you got to be looking at those numbers going, ouch. So that's a striking difference in the Democratic field. But we do have former Democrat and Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan, who is now running without party affiliation. He used to be a Democrat. And he is much closer to Benson in the money game with 2.4 million on hand. So it's really interesting to see him really outraising a huge crop of both Democrats and Republicans.
You know, the general will, of course, be interesting with Duggan running without party affiliation. But, man, it would have been exciting to see a Democratic primary between Duggan and Benson.
Can you imagine?
It would have been good. We are a long way from the primary, of course, but these campaign finance reports, continue to tell us a story. It'll be interesting to see how both primaries develop. And if we start to see some of these candidates that, we see the money differences, if we see them taking a different path ahead of the April filing deadline.
All right, we are going to switch gears. And after this short break, we're going to be joined by Lance Boldrey, an attorney from the Dykema law firm, to talk about a controversial budget item. It's an increase in the state's marijuana tax. Stick around.
Welcome back to MichMash. We're joined now by Lance Boldrey, an attorney with Dykema law firm with a focus on cannabis issues. Lance, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So the final budget signed by the governor includes a 24% cannabis wholesale tax as a means to help pay for state roads. We're going to get into details in a bit, but what was your initial reaction when you heard that was in the final product?
Well, we didn't know it was in the final product until right toward the end. I mean, the initial reaction was that the legislature did everything they could here to evade the protections of the Constitution and to hide the ball on this until the very last second. So that's sort of the process reaction. In terms of the economics, we're dealing with a cannabis industry that's under a lot of financial stress and challenges right now. And there's no question we're going to watch more of our clients go out of business as a result of this.
So how would this tax work? What does a wholesale tax actually mean? And, as you answer this question, can you get into a little bit more, the challenges that the industry is facing and, how this might compound that issue?
Sure. Let me start with sort of how the tax will work mechanically to the extent that we know that. And I say it that way because there are some things that are going to be left to Treasury to implement. To my knowledge, Treasury has not reached out to anyone in the cannabis industry, the accounting industry, et cetera, to talk about implementation issues. So we're going by sort of what we read in the bill right now. It is a 24% tax on the sale to a retailer. So that last sale from either a grower or a processor to a retailer is taxed at a 24% rate, or at least what's nominally a 24% rate. What the bill makes clear is it's actually 24% of the invoice price, regardless of whether that invoice price includes taxes, fees, other charges, and without accounting for any discounts due to business relationships or volume purchases or anything like that. So with it being a tax on everything on the invoice, including tax, if you line item that, it actually becomes a tax on a tax. It gets up to about it's a nice calculus problem that I had to have my teenage daughter help me figure out. But it gets up to almost a 32% tax effectively on the wholesale price. That's for businesses that are independent from one another, from sort of the regular market sales. For companies that are related companies, or what we call vertically integrated, where you have the grower, the processor, the retailer, all operated by the same company, the retail price is really more a nominal price for tax purposes that they calculate as it moves between those tiers. And for that, Treasury is just going to apply an average wholesale price. So they're going to look at what the price is among the independent entities, and they're going to derive an average. And then we're going to say, okay, that's effectively the tax on the vertically integrated. And then I think the folks that get most negatively impacted by this are the so-called micro businesses, which are by and large, the social equity part of the industry, folks that have come in as really craft producers. They don't have any wholesale activity at all because everything is grown, processed, and sold at the exact same location. So they literally are statutorily prohibited from making a wholesale purchase or making a wholesale sale, yet they're going to have the average wholesale tax applied to effectively their production.
So there is already a 10% excise tax at retail and a 6% sales tax on cannabis. So give us some numbers a little bit. I mean, not too many because my brain. So how much would this realistically change the prices for consumers?
I think that remains to be seen, sort of how much gets passed down. I mean, if the entire burden of the tax gets passed down, particularly at, the micro level, you could easily see prices going up by, 20, 30%, maybe even more. It's going to be a difficult thing for the system to adjust to in terms of who ends up paying that burden within the chain, how much can get passed on to the end customer, how much can't. But margins are so thin in this industry right now that I don't see there's any way not to pass on the vast majority of that tax burden to the customers. There's just no real give in the system to account for it otherwise. And I think even the Senate analysis recognizes that. And I think you can look at that as maybe another source of what the state thinks the impact on consumers will be. Last year, the state took in $320 million roughly from the 10% excise tax. They're projecting $420 million from the wholesale tax. So you wash that through, it's essentially it's more than doubling the level of excise tax that a consumer would be paying.
So prices are relatively low in the state's cannabis market right now. So I have seen some argument that like, hey, the industry can take this. Prices can go higher. You can just pass it on to the consumer. They'll pay it because prices are so low, especially compared to other states. What do you make of that argument? Is that a little too cavalier?
It's far too cavalier. And in fact, even the state itself doesn't believe that. If you look at the Senate fiscal analysis, it projects a 14% decrease in consumption. So even the state is looking at it and acknowledging that sales are going to go down, even if this tax is passed on. And I think, sort of the dirty little secret of the industry, but the dirty little secret of the state too, is out of that $300+ million in tax revenue, $100 million of that is coming from sales at border communities. These are sales to folks who are coming in from other states that either don't have legal cannabis or have a higher tax rate. Those are not people who are going to decide, hey, I'm going to buy 14% less product this year, or I'm going to, make that what was a $200 purchase, I'm now only going to be able to buy $100 because I got to pay more tax. Those are purchasers who are just going to go elsewhere. If you're in Ohio and you're coming up to Monroe because it's cheaper in Michigan, you're not going to make that trip anymore when there isn't a price distinction between Ohio and Michigan.
The state is cautioning folks to not speculate on how the tax would work and what it would look like as it is implemented until the Department of Treasury releases guidance. You've been speaking out about the tax and saying it could lead to an actual tax rate of higher than 24%. What do you make of the state saying, well, we shouldn't say that just yet? Everybody slow down.
Well, I think part of it is they probably haven't figured it out yet. They're trying to run too quickly here. I mean, there's been no outreach on the part of Treasury. Talking to some accountant colleagues last week, they sort of raised the example of when we did the pass-through election for LLCs and closely held businesses a couple of years ago. Treasury's guidance for the tax year beginning January 1 came out on December 23rd. And I think the sort of the betting money right now is saying Treasury's probably not even going to have guidance out in the field until after this tax goes into effect. And when you're seeing several weeks, and in the coming weeks, I think is what the Treasury website says right now for when we should expect further information. Well, there's not a lot more coming weeks before January's here.
The state has also said that the tax will lead to $420 million for roads. How realistic do you think that is? Do you think this tax is going to, if it does get implemented, if it is ruled legal, do you think we're going to see that much money come from it?
I doubt it. I don't have any economic study to back that up, but the state's economic study is bunk as well. And I think the fact that they picked a $420 million number out of the air is really adding a lot of insult to injury as they're passing a tax that is going to cost Michigan citizens their jobs.
There's also a lawsuit now challenging this tax that was recently filed. Why do industry members think it's not only bad for business, but also illegal?
I think you need to sort of put this tax in the broader context of what we've seen this legislature doing through adopt and amend recently. Obviously was for those sort of not in the cannabis industry, but in the legislative industry are probably more familiar with that. But it was a means by which the legislature essentially evaded the requirement for a supermajority vote on an initiative. And that's exactly what they've done here as well. If you look back at the campaign for what is now called the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act, there's a lot of evidence from that campaign that 10% excise tax was set at a very purposeful number. It was set at a rate that would generate revenue for the state, yet still allow for folks to move over from the illicit market to the legal market, because there'd actually be a price advantage still to doing so, or something close to a price advantage. That tax system was deliberately set. The purpose of MRTMA itself says that it's to establish a tax system for the reason of reducing the illicit market. So it's critical to the initiated law. Anything that amends an initiated law has to be done by a 3/4 supermajority vote. And in this case, the legislature didn't do that. They sidestepped that requirement by creating this new standalone act. When the legislature adopted this tax, they sidestepped a lot of other constitutional protections as well. For one, you can't change the purpose of a bill as it moves through the legislature. That's part of the title object clause of the Constitution. This bill came out, was introduced rather, as a bill to create the Comprehensive Road Funding Transportation Act. The bill had the word tax only in its title, not anywhere in its substantive provisions. The bill did not mention marijuana at all. Then the House suspends the rules. They throw this thing on the floor. They substitute in entirely new subject matter and pass it instantly. That's a change in the purpose. And it also violates the 5-day rule, which is another constitutional protection that requires that a bill be before each chamber for at least 5 days before it's passed, so that the public has notice of what it's doing, so that legislators have notice of what it's doing, and so that it's not simply adopting something in the dark of night with no public scrutiny. Here, the House didn't do that. They substituted in this new language and passed it much more close to a 5-minute waiting period than a 5-day waiting period. And it amends also violates the constitutional requirement or prohibition, rather, on amending a statute by reference. And you can see that the legislature knows it did this too, because every other time that they've taken action to affect adult use marijuana businesses, they've done that by amending MRTMA by a 3/4 vote. A lot of their changes over the last several years, they'll change the Medical Marijuana Facilities Act at the same time as they'll change the Adult Use Act. They do those by separate bills. Why? Because the MMFLA is legislatively created. It only needs a 50% vote. MRTMA was voter initiated. It requires a 3/4 supermajority vote. Here, they just did everything they could to ignore that and to really blindside the industry and the people.
And, our listeners are familiar with Adopt and Amend because we have talked about that court case many times, and that took
many times.
6 years to get to a final resolution. So this, court case was filed earlier this month, and we'll see when we get a final resolution, but I expect many years. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see, and we should get a first indication here fairly soon. I am counsel along with some of my colleagues at the Honigman Law Firm for the Michigan Cannabis Industries Association in that case, and we will be filing a motion for a preliminary injunction today, asking the Court of Claims to stop this tax from even going into effect while the courts determine whether it's constitutional or not.
So I want to go back to discussing, some of the challenges the industry is facing right now. I think that could be like another 2-hour-long episode, which we are not going to do today. But can you give sort of listeners a picture of like what is happening with business owners in this space? I think a lot of the news we hear is, hey, there are border communities with 20 stores, sales are high, prices are low. That can make it seem like things are really positive. But, you're telling a different story when it comes to the business owners themselves. So can you give us, a little bit of that picture?
Yeah, I've been involved in the regulated industry space for almost 30 years now in Lansing. And before this represented and still do gaming interests, the casinos. And there's the same misconception about cannabis as casinos, which is that, hey, this is just a license to print money. And it's an easy business. If you get one of these licenses, you've received the golden ticket, and that is far from the case. We have a lot of systemic problems in Michigan, and we have some self-inflicted wounds on the part of the industry, and we have federal illegality, which continues to be, I think, the biggest issue that everybody in this space faces. The federal illegality has a direct effect on the economic performance of the financial performance of companies in this space, because federal tax code prohibits companies engaged in the cannabis business from taking any business deductions on their taxes. So where other companies can essentially be taxed on their net income, cannabis companies are taxed essentially on net revenue on their top line. The only subtraction is for the costs of the goods that are being produced. So I think a lot of folks rushed into this industry thinking, federal legalization is right around the corner. As those of us in the public policy space know, if your business plan is based on Congress doing something, that's fool's gold. It's certainly not something you should ever base significant financial decisions around. But a lot of folks did. And because that hasn't changed, we've got a lot of folks who are struggling financially. We've also got a lot of competition because there are no license caps in the state of Michigan. We're one of the few states that doesn't. And we've got a lot of irrational exuberance from initial investors. I mean, I think we all watched SkyMet here in the Lansing area come in and immediately be one of the biggest players in the space, and not long after go into receivership. Well, when they went into receivership, you could see from the court documents in that case that they were projecting when they came into this business, they were going to get $3,000 a pound for marijuana at wholesale. And that, like any other business, it's just going to go up a little bit every year. Where if you looked at Colorado or Washington or Oregon or other open markets where there were no license caps, you saw that the pricing may have started up about that high, which is where it was in the illicit market, but it quickly plummeted to less than $1,000. And so we've gone from, in this state, a wholesale price of $3,000 some dollars a pound at the very inception of the industry, down to a wholesale price of 400 some flower for less than that. And we have clients who've come into this industry who have closed their doors because literally the wholesale price that they can command is lower than their cost of production. We've seen just among some of the clients we work with, 800,000 square feet of grow space in this state close within the last year. It's a highly competitive market. There's been a lot of overinvestment, and there's a lot of business failures out there.
Now that the legislature has passed this tax, they're discussing bills that they say will help the industry. A package of Senate bills would limit licenses the state can grant for certain businesses, citing oversupply and other issues hurting the industry. Do you think that's a good idea?
I do. I mean, I think there are a lot of changes that the industry needs statutorily. License caps is something that folks have been advocating for quite some time. I question personally how much impact that will have right now. All of our business activity as a law firm in this space was dominated by folks acquiring licenses for the first couple of years. Then it was dominated by M&A activity, where people from out of state were buying up Michigan companies, and Michigan companies were consolidating. And I don't think we've had a single new license application for a truly new facility here in probably well over a year. There just isn't the demand for the licenses right now. I think what caps would do, if you allow those licenses to move, the current licenses, is it would at least maybe generate a little bit of market value for those licenses down the road as the market straightens itself out. Some of the other initiatives I think are pretty critical for the industry. Certainly addressing the illicit market. It's still a significant part of the marketplace in Michigan, both in terms of sales of marijuana itself in and out of the state, as well as sales of so-called hemp-derived products that are essentially marijuana. And those are unfortunately the ones that you see in the liquor stores down the street from the schools, not in the licensed industry. I think the legislature getting a hold of those problems and allowing for some real enforcement teeth will go a long way toward helping solve the ills of the industry.
All right, Lance, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.